where we talk about the murder that the Einsatzgruppen carried out in 1941 and afterwards near the town of Vilna. We have testimonies of several people, and one of them is someone who at the time was a young boy. His name is Shalom Sorensen. In Vilna there were about 60,000 Jews, and in the summer of 1941 there was a killing spree in which about 10,000 Jews were murdered. Then the Nazis set up two ghettos and they emptied them out. One was for weak people, one was for stronger people, and they emptied out the ghetto of the weaker people, bringing these people to a place called Ponar outside of Vilna where they were shot. And by December of 1941, of the 60,000, roughly 60,000 Jews in Vilna, 2/3 had been murdered. So this is Shalom Sorensen's testimony about what happened to him. And they took him and his family in the summer of 41 to be murdered. He said, "I stood next to my grandfather. When they gave the order to shoot, my grandfather, Shmuel Livshin, my mother's father, started praying, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel. I only managed to say, Hear, O Israel, once before they shot. I fell before the shots went off and the dead fell on top of me. I lay like that for a long time. I didn't cry. I was petrified. I lay there. They kept on shooting. Later, after a long time, the shooting died down, and it became more or less quiet. I thought it was night. I started to move around, trying to get out. When I began to move, someone grabbed my leg. It turned out that another boy was lying on top of me. It turned out that he wasn't injured either. He was okay. Somehow we helped each other get out from under the dead." That's his testimony. Now I want to read you another testimony. As I said, this is from a different place and a different time. This is a testimony of somebody named Ronnie Yamsud, and he was 13 years old in 1975 when the Khmer Rouge swept into Phnom Penh. He and his extended family were removed from their homes, and they were taken to the famed ruins of Angkor Wat, and they were forced to work in a collective camp. During the last week of 1977, Ronnie's family and others were rounded up for the last time before being shot by the Khmer Rouge. Of course, the dozens killed on that December day, of the dozens killed, only Ronnie survived. Today he is living in Oregon as a landscape architect, and this is his testimony of what's called the Tony Sop Lake Massacre. And he says, "We were no more than 300 yards off the main road when they asked us to sit down on the edge of a small, shallow canal that ran east to west. Both of our legs stretched forward. We had to shut up or they would beat us. In a matter of minutes, a large group of at least 50 people suddenly emerged from a hidden place in the nearby forest. It was really dark by that time, but I could tell from their silhouettes that they were soldiers with AK-47 rifles, carbines, and large clubs in their hands. One of them began to shout loudly at us, as the rest surrounded the group with their rifles aiming directly at us. People began to plead for their lives. The soldiers screamed for all of us to shut up. They said that they only wished to ask a few questions. That's all that they wanted. They also said that this was an interrogation and that they suspected there were enemies among us. They claimed there were Vietnamese agents in our group, which I knew was a bogus claim, since we all had known each other for many years. It was all a tactic, a dirty trick to keep us calm, weak, and under their control. But the tactic had been very effective because all the strong men who could have risen against them were the first ones to go. Those people left in my group were women and children, the sick and the weak. They had us right where they wanted. It was all a premeditated plan. A soldier walked towards me, yanking away a cotton towel and shredding it into small strips. I was the first one to be tied up tightly by the soldiers with one of the strips. I was stunned and quite terrified. I began to resist a little. After a few blows to the head with rifle butts, I could only let them do as they pleased with me. My head began to bleed from a wound. I was still semi-conscious. I could feel the pain and blood flowing down my face. They were using me as an example of what one could get if they got any kind of resistance. They quickly tied the rest of the group without any problems. By this time, it was totally chaotic as people continued to plead for their lives. I was getting dizzier as blood continued to drip across my face and into my right eye. It was the first time that I had tears in my eyes, not from the blood or the pain, but from the reality of what was now setting in. I was numb with fear. I was beyond horrified when I heard the clobbering begin. Somehow I knew that this was it. One of his friends' elderly father, was next to me, and his upper torso contracted several times before he fell on me. On that moment, I noticed a small boy whom I knew well get up and start to call for his mother. Suddenly there was a warm splash on my face and body. I knew it was definitely not mud. It was the little boy's blood, perhaps his brain tissue scattering from the impact. The others only let out short but terrifying spurted sounds. I could hear their breathing stop cold in its tracks. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. It was so unreal. It happened in a matter of minutes. But I can still vividly remember every trifling detail. I closed my eyes, but the terrifying sounds continued to penetrate my ear canals, piercing my eardrums. The first blow came when I was lying down to the ground with a corpse partially covering my lower body. It hit me just below my right shoulder blade. I remember that one very well. The next one hit me just above my neck on the right side of my head. I believe it was the one that knocked me out that night. The rest of the clobbering, which included at least 15 blows, landed everywhere on my skinny little body. Fortunately, I did not feel them until much later. I do not remember anything after that except that I slept very well that night, unconscious from the beating. Suffering is suffering is suffering. You can't possibly try to decide whose suffering was worse, and you can't possibly try to make a hierarchy of suffering. That doesn't mean that we don't have to try to understand how these events are similar and how they're different, and how we have to be careful of the terminology we use for them. The word genocide is a legal term. It was coined by a man named Raphael Lemkin right after the end of World War II. Raphael Lemkin himself was a refugee who managed to get out of Europe before the Holocaust. And he was a lawyer by trade. He was a man who was expert in the law. And he formulated this law, and he brought it to the United Nations, which passed it December 9, 1948, what we call the Genocide Convention. It's really interesting that when people have written about Lemkin have shown that he was very influenced in understanding what happened to the Jews in World War II by what had happened to the Armenians in World War I. You know, there's a famous saying, Hitler said nobody will remember the Armenians, and he's probably right that most people did not, but there were some people that did. Lemkin was one of them. And it brought him to formulate the law. The genocide law has two distinct parts. One part is the destruction of all members of a given group. And the other part is the destruction of a group to the point that it can no longer exist as a group. They're very closely related ideas, but they're not the same thing. Because if you're killing everybody in a group, that's it. But if you're destroying it to the point where it can't exist as a group, that's because you've done enough things to the group, critical mass has been reached, and it can't exist as a group. When we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about the first part of the definition. That's really what fits what happened to the Jews in World War II, or at least what the Nazis attempted. They didn't manage to murder all the Jews, but their plan, of course, once they have a policy we call the final solution, is to murder all the Jews. And we know from their documentation, we have the Wannsee Conference document, right? That's, you can find, some of you might have been at Yad Vashem, you see it displayed, the first page of it, that has a list of countries and the Jewish populations in it. And not all of those countries are countries that are in Europe, and not all of those countries are countries the Nazis controlled at the time, which shows us that they had a plan that was well beyond even the areas they controlled, that they wanted to murder Jews. What happens to many of the other groups in World War II, and what happens in other genocides that we know about, generally fits the second definition more, of the destruction of a group so it no longer can exist as a group. but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But still, again, we want to understand the Jew. There are a lot of scholars today that are dealing in genocide studies. Oh, I'm sorry, and I should say this. It's important to say the Holocaust is a genocide. I mean, the word genocide comes to describe what the Holocaust was, and that's where it came into being, right? So the Holocaust is a genocide, and you shouldn't say it's not a genocide. It is a kind of a genocide. But as I said, genocide has two different ways of deciding what is a genocide with those differences. Now, scholars try to look at the commonalities between genocides, and a number of different scholars have said different things about those commonalities, some that are worth mentioning. There's a professor that deals in genocide studies at Yale. His name is Ben Kiernan, and he suggests that in genocides you generally see obsessions with antiquity. And again, my area is Nazis, so the Nazis had some mythical past, right? That's what they were thinking about. There's a feeling that agriculture is important, that the land is important, right? There's an idea of territorial expansion that goes with many of the genocides. And he says, at least in his research, that he thinks these were part of the Holocaust or part of what happened in Rwanda and in Cambodia. Looking at those three incidents, that's where he looks at these commonalities. Another scholar by the name of Eric Weiss looked at the Holocaust. He looked at Cambodia, Yugoslavia, what happened in Yugoslavia, and at Stalin's genocidal activities. And he says that what you can see as a commonality here is that these were carried out by the state. So another idea that you might find a commonality in genocides, an idea that could be, is that they were carried out by states. My professor, teacher, and friend and colleague Yehuda Bauer has said, and I'll quote, "Every genocide is perpetrated with the best technical and bureaucratic means at the disposal of the perpetrators." That's what he sees. The truth is, what I just read to you about Cambodia, that wasn't all that technological, what they were doing there. But let's say what Yehuda says, that generally in genocides they harness technology and the best of the bureaucracy to carry it out. And that fits in with the idea that it's a state-applied crime. What I would submit to you is that it's just as important to understand the differences between the genocides that happen as it is to understand the commonalities. The commonalities are very important to understand. Certainly if you're talking about genocide prevention and such things, that's what you want to understand. Where things are similar, how do you identify this as belonging to the class of crimes we might call a genocide? But it's no less important when you look at them all, and I believe, to look at the differences between them. And when we look at the Holocaust or the Shoah, whatever word we want to use, compared to other genocides, as I say, one of the very important things about it is that it's so total and inclusive in what it wants to do, that it really wants to destroy the Jews everywhere, and that's what it's all about. It's a murder that's based not on a real thing. It's based on a constructed conception of who Jews are. That really doesn't have anything to do with who Jews really are. I mean, like any stereotype, there's a tiny bit of truth that is taken and blown so out of proportion that it no longer has any relation to reality, and that's what this comes out of. So, I mean, yes, there's some things in there that, maybe if you trace it all the way back, you might say something, a tiny grain of something that might be true here, but again, so distorted that it's really no longer true, and it's a fantastic idea, right, versus a real, tangible idea. But most other genocides are based on tangible conflicts and things that are going on. In Rwanda, for example, there was the whole issue of which of the tribes, the Tutsi or the Hutu, would be superior in the society and who would control the society. And in a sense, the genocide came as a revolution against those that had been in power of the two tribes, right? And it was a real conflict. I mean, a real conflict. At least there was a real issue there. It wasn't this issue that Jews are out to control the world or something. It was a real conflict, a real issue. And so you see that in most other genocides, I think, as they happen. That doesn't mean that when you look at something like the Holocaust, there's nothing in it that's ever tangible. And there's no question that issues about taking over Jewish property and things are part of what the Holocaust is all about. But that's not at the heart of what that was about, the tangible parts of it. It was sort of like the extra added benefit that they took over property. as they murdered the Jews they believed to be this evil thing in the world that was causing all the problems in the world. So getting property was an extra added bonus. It was an important propaganda tool when they talked about it. But as I say, there's a big difference just on that I see between the Holocaust and other genocides that we know about. Sometimes when we look at two events that occur, they look to be very similar. As I said, suffering. First of all, you hear the testimonies. They often sound very similar. If you hear testimonies, by the way, of Jews who went through the Holocaust and the Roma, or what non-politically correct we call the Gypsies, what they went through. And I was present once at Yad Vashem where a number of them gave testimonies, and once they began to tell their stories, it was really very much similar to what you would hear any Jewish person who went through the Holocaust tell about being deported and how they were treated and the family suffering and all those things. It was really very similar. But still, even when things can be very similar, there can be very important differences. Some of them, people who heard me speak not too long ago, I mentioned a book called Bloodlands, which is by Timothy Snyder. It's been a real bestseller in our world of Holocaust and genocide studies. It's a book that looks at one part of Eastern Europe where, from the period from the 1920s until the early 50s, he reckons that about 14 million people were murdered, either by Stalin or Hitler. And he looks at this one area to try to understand and compare and look at these differences. And he draws more commonalities than he does distinctions in the book. And as I was reading the book, one of the things that really grabbed my attention was the following thing that he presents. He talks about the murder of the Jews in Belarus. And the murder of the Jews in Belarus was like the other murder by the special units of the SS and those that worked with them, where they took people out of their homes, as in the thing I read to you from Vilna as well, took them out and they shot them in mass systematic shootings. A little later on in the period, Belarusian peasants were murdered in the same way sometimes. And that's what Timothy Snyder writes about, how they were murdered in the same way. They were taken out of their villages, and they were taken out and they were shot in the same way after taking trenches and shot into them. The thing is that he doesn't talk about the why, and why these are different. And they are different. The Jews were being murdered simply because they were Jews, because of Nazi ideology and their belief of Jews as evil and their policy of murdering all the Jews, and it didn't matter anything you did. When they were murdering the Belarusian peasants, it was for a reason. The reason was that there was partisan activity was very strong in those areas. These were wooded areas and places, I don't know if anybody saw Defiance, if you saw the movie, those are the areas we're talking about. And there was partisan activity there. And it was a real problem for the Germans, this partisan activity. And how do partisans sustain themselves? They go to villages. It's in the villages that get their food and they get clothing and other things they need. And some villages help them, happily, and some villages give over their things by gunpoint, and some villagers cooperate with the partisans and some don't. The Nazis didn't distinguish between any of the villagers who did or didn't, or the villages that, if there was a rumor or any inkling that a village might have helped in some way, that's when they were murdering the people in the village. So even if the way they killed them was the same, with the exact same method, and even if the period of time is the same basic situation, right, of World War II and Nazi occupation, German occupation in those areas, there is a tremendous difference in the murder, because the Jews are being murdered out of this great ideological reason, and the peasants are being murdered because they have a problem that they want to deal with, and they deal with it ruthlessly. But they're dealing with a real problem in this case, and not some construct about who somebody is, and therefore you have to shoot them. They're killing innocent people, of course, because they just drag everybody into the net. But it's all triggered by something that's true, that's happening. And that's an important distinction. Sometimes maybe it sounds academic, but it's not academic, because it goes to the heart of what's happening. That you're murdering one group of people because you want to get rid of all of them, and another group gets murdered because you have a problem and you're cruel, and you say, this is how I deal with my problem. And they're very different ideas. So we have to look closely again, and you have to look at those distinctions. And in this particular book, and there's some other books, a number of other books that talk about different genocides and compare them to Holocaust. As I say, one of the problems is this lack of distinction that we see. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that it's very, very, very important that that we look at similar events. And we look at anything that you call a genocide, and it's going to be similar events that fits into a category. You must look at them. You know, the way you learn is by comparing and contrasting them. That's how you learn. You have to do it. But you have to do it very carefully. It's one of the things that I think is very strong. And what happens out there in the world that we inhabit is that this doesn't happen so much. There's a lot of lack of attention paid to looking at the details and trying to really understand what's going on and putting things all into one soup. That's one of the things that happens a great deal. One of the most problematic discussions out there today is something that's being called the double genocide. And it's problematic because it's a very political discussion. And the double genocide is something that's being discussed in the Baltic countries, particularly in Lithuania, but not only. In Hungary, it's discussed. And the double genocide is part of what I'm saying, what Snyder is writing about. It's about Stalin and Hitler's crimes. And they're being billed as a double genocide because they happen in the same space of time by these two tyrannical leaders, and often again in the same countries as people are suffering. And there's a museum in Budapest called the House of Terror, which is exactly about this. It mostly talks about Stalin's crimes, but it also does talk about the Holocaust. And it pits these two things together, puts them together into the same box. Now, there's a lot of reasons to talk about these things together. And I would be the last to say, no, Stalin, we know Hitler's crimes, right? But Stalin also committed really horrendous crimes that may well be considered genocide. What he did to the Ukrainians in the mid-1930s, where he was collectivizing the kolkhozes. They're trying to put up collective settlements to collectivize the agriculture. They initiated shortages of foods in doing this, and the measures that they did caused for shortages of food, and there was tremendous starvation. The Ukrainians have a word for it, the Holodomor. That's what they call it. It's also sometimes called the Ukrainian Holocaust. You can see that on the web as well and other places with that terminology. But it was really quite a crime that he committed, Stalin, in triggering this to happen, and not just triggering it, really constructing the situation. And he certainly persecuted other groups of people. He persecuted the Poles. In 1937, he accused about 111,000 Poles of espionage, and they were all shot in areas that were under his jurisdiction. And then in 1941, when he went into Polish territories, there was a tremendous persecution of Poles as well. And there was lots of people that were murdered out of this. The most famous, of course, are the Polish officers that were murdered in Katyn. 4,000 Polish officers were murdered by Stalin's people. And when the Nazis discovered it in 1943, they made a big deal out of it. Let's see what Stalin did, right? But all told, about 22,000 Polish soldiers were taken by Stalin, and most of them never came back. So there's persecution. There's persecutions of other groups. Stalin moves people around. He moved around a number of groups, a whole list of people that he moved in other places around the Soviet Union. And moving people around is not putting them in first-class train cars, and sending them off to a nice place where they're going to live. It's, taking them and sending them to nowhere, where they have to somehow live, and doing it in a very cruel way. So there's always a lot of suffering and death in all of this. And he does this a great deal, especially during the war years. The gulags, the gulags are a camp system that they're set up by Stalin. And of course, I don't know if anybody has a number of how many people actually died in the gulags, but Snyder in his book writes about them. It says in 1943 alone, 2.4 million passed through the system. And in 1933 to 45, 1 million people died in the gulags. So a pretty horrible system, right? If the numbers are right, I don't know, but it's pretty large, so it's a pretty bad system to be in. But it's also, when you read about the gulags and why they were set up, you learn that they have a dual purpose. They're set up for two real reasons. One is to get rid of opponents, of course. But even more important as time goes on is Stalin sees them as something for cheap labor. And the way the Gulag works is that if you meet your labor quota, you're given the food that you're allowed to have, which is just enough to live on. If you don't meet the labor quota, then you get less food. And if you exceed your labor quota, you get more food. There's nothing like this in the kinds of camps the Nazis set up. They don't do something like this. I mean, it shows about how important the labor is, that these camps are not being set up like the 6 extermination camps that Nazis will set up in the Holocaust. That's not what these are, even though a lot of people find. So there's a similarity, there's a difference. So as I say, there's a big discussion now about the double genocide, and they talk about Stalin's crimes, which are real crimes. But they talk about it together with the Holocaust, put it all into one soup. And again, as I say, I think there's differences that make it so that you don't want to do that so readily, but more important are the political aspects of this. And I'll tell you why. In the countries that suffered under Stalin, there's a great belief that it was the Jews that were at the head of the communist thing, right, this Bolshevization that's going on. That the Jews were at the head of it. Now, it's true that Jews were disproportionately represented in leadership in the Communist Party from its beginning. It also means that of all the people in this party, very few were actually Jews, because there were so many other people around. I'm saying, again, disproportionately, meaning their percentages, they were much higher. And there was a lot of Jews who weren't communists and weren't very happy with it. Right? To say that all Jews are communists or that Jews were at the head of the communist movement is a tremendous exaggeration of what really was. Although, again, there's an element that Jews are involved. You can say they're not involved, they certainly are. But how? Right? But when you believe that it was the Jews who were at the heart of Stalin's crimes, or the real perpetrators of Stalin's crimes, then you can do the following thing. You can say, well, in our societies, say you're in Lithuania, Lithuanians engaged in the murder of their Jewish neighbors during the Holocaust. It's a fact. We all know it. Lithuanian battalions were involved in this. In Latvia, there were Latvian battalions involved in the murder as well. I mean, we know there were trials in West Germany afterwards about some of this. There's a very strong record. And you can't deny that it happens unless you're really trying to deny history. If you don't do that, it happened. But what you can say is that these were the margins of our society, which isn't really all that accurate. But you can say that. And you can say, in any way, look how much we suffered from the Jews. I mean, we weren't so good to them, but they were even worse to us. And then you can duck your responsibility for what you did to your neighbors. And that's one of the reasons this double genocide that's come down the pipe, it's become a really serious political issue, is such an important issue. Where is it so important? The Parliament of Europe, 2 years ago, passed that the 23rd of August would be a day to remember the 2 genocides. The Parliament of Europe. Now, why the 23rd? Because the 23rd of August is a day that the Nazis and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact that then allowed Germany to invade Poland and then allowed Stalin and his people to take the eastern half of Poland. That's the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And that's the day it was signed. And so that's a very significant day. And for those that want to push this double genocide, see, look, we have the 2 criminals, and this is the day we're going to push. It's my opinion, and it's not only my opinion, but it's also my opinion, that again, that you should remember Stalin's crimes. They were horrible crimes. You should learn about them. You should know about them if they affected you and your family and the place you live in, and your society was involved in them in some way, whether they were perpetrators or whether they were victims. You need to know about them. I mean, it's a very important piece of the 20th century history, and it can be very personal to a lot of people. Again, they really do need to know about it. But I really believe that mixing it, intertwining with the Holocaust doesn't serve our understanding of either of them. If we try to look at them just as 2 things that go together, then we're missing, as I say, the important differences about what they are, and we allow those people that want to manipulate it for the political ends that I was talking about to do that as well. We give them the ability to do that by putting them together. So part of this challenge today of looking at the Holocaust, looking at genocides, is very much wrapped around this particular issue. It's not, as I say, that Holocaust is so unique that you can't talk about anything else. That's not true. And you can certainly look like those two testimonies I gave you in the beginning, not just that they're similar in so many ways of the suffering, but there's a lot of reason to look at, what's going on and where things were similar and where it's different, especially to help us to try and deal with things like preventing these things happening in the future. There's a lot of room for that. But the question is how you do it, and then how much political spin you start doing on it in order to gain other things that you want that aren't, I don't know what the right word is, that aren't pure. They're, these things that you want to gain politically. And I say, so that's very much what the issues are when we talk about the two Holocaust and genocide together. So anyway, the idea was to talk to you a little bit, then open up for questions. So I think I said enough at this point, and I'd be very happy to open up for questions about this or something else that you might want to ask me. I'm happy to try to answer. So please, unless you're so tired.
So you're saying Timothy Snyder, he's not a Jewish scholar, is he?
I'm sorry, what?
Mr. Snyder, you mentioned?
Timothy Snyder?
Yeah, Timothy Snyder.
Jewish scholar?
Who
is
is
he Jewish?
Yes.
No.
I don't think he's
I don't
Jewish.
think so. I don't think
He's
He's at Yale University. He's I don't know if he's a professor yet. He's at Yale, and he actually is the expert in Eastern European studies, not in Holocaust studies, and then came to write this book that he wrote.
He doesn't differentiate Stalin Jews, any particular Jews for the rest of the world.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
He didn't make any differentiation to the Jewish people as opposed to the other people being persecuted.
Well, he does. Look at I want to say Timothy Snyder's book is problematic, but Timothy Snyder was a very careful person, and what I was talking about, the political things, he doesn't go anywhere near that, and he doesn't, and he's careful. He tries to be careful in his language. He doesn't do that. The problem, as I said, I don't know if it needs quotes or not, is that people use his book as fodder then to misuse his book, because there's all kinds of things in it that are easily misused, and because, as I said, he's not clear enough about distinctions in the book. It's easier for people to then misuse it for this political agenda that they have. That's really, Snyder is a serious fellow, and he's a real historian, and he's in a reputable place, obviously Yale, and he's not a criminal of any kind, he's not a denier or anything like that. He's a serious guy, that he wrote an important book. It is an important book. It's just a flawed book. So I don't mean to say anything, to put him in some category where he's not acceptable or anything. He's a book that should be read. It's interesting to read. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah. How does the differences between the two terms inform and help us in that aspect?
Right.
The implications of that.
Well, again. Part of my worry about what goes on is because of the political usages of this versus academic or people that want to do good usages, right? Which is why I'm saying I think you need to look at Holocaust and genocide. You need to understand that Holocaust has some factors that other genocides don't have, just for your general understanding, but also because if you're trying to understand what's happening around you, it's not going to be so simple to determine what's going on if we can do it. And how to work to prevent such things. You need to find understanding, I believe, to try to do that. So it's not just an academic thing. The fine understanding helps us because the world's complicated. If we throw everything into one soup and we just say, well, there's Holocaust, there's genocide, there's anti-Semitism, there's racial hatred, there's xenophobia, and we have to fight it all, well, that's a true statement, but they're not all. Those aren't all the same phenomena. They're all different things. They all may require some tools that are similar to fight them and some that are different to fight them. And so you have to understand where they're coming from. And the event that's happening in your backyard that you want to deal with, right? You have to understand what it's all about. And history is not a one-on-one tool. You can't look at history and say, oh, I learned the history and now I know exactly what to do with my reality or with the unfolding future, but the history can help you to deal with it. It's not ever going to be a one-on-one tool. If it was, that would really be easy. All of us historians would become Nobel Prize winners.
How do you combat if the reason that the Nazis wanted to murder Jews was an ideological reason, it was no practical reason, right? It was an idea they created that was based on myth. How do you combat that? Because it's just hate for the sake of hate, right? So.
Okay, it's, again.
It's like you can't reason out of someone's belief if that's what they want to believe.
Yes and no. Why is it yes? Well, maybe in a real group where there's core believers who have illogical beliefs, you're not going to be able to reason with them. But of course, a phenomenon like Nazism comes into power not because everybody in the society is a core believer in Nazism. At least not in the beginning. I mean, not in the early years, and even it never really happens that everybody in society would be a core believer, a strong believer in everything that the Nazis talk about, and really, the fervent believers in it. But there's a lot of people that will be attracted to different aspects of this, will accept different parts of it, and there you have a lot more room to try, I think, not necessarily Nazis, but other things too, to educate about it. I mean, I've given this example a million times, and I'll give it again because I like it a lot. I studied with a wonderful man named George Mawson. He passed away quite a few years ago. He was at the University of Wisconsin and at Hebrew University, and he was a wonderful historian. He was just a really nice man and a wonderful historian. And George told us in class years and years ago about this thing that he had, and he explained it like this. He said, I'd be sitting on a train in Germany. He was born in Germany. And he was left during the Nazi period. I'd be sitting on the train, and somebody would say, the Jews are out to take over Germany. He said, and I would have this package of cards, and I would look for the proper card, and I would flip it out, and it would give me the answer that of so many ministers since the end of World War I in Germany, only this small number are Jews, and therefore they're not out to take over the government. George Mawson was trying to fight lies with truth, not him. The people that created it were called the Central Verein. They were a Jewish organization in Germany, and they're the ones that tried to combat what the Nazis were saying about the Jews with truth against them, right? To a certain extent, you could say they were trying to educate people against the lies. Teaching truth versus lies is part of education. Were they successful? Not at all. What happened? We know what happened. They weren't successful. Education, is our best tool, even though it doesn't always work as well as we want it to. And even though it can't always do it, but you still have to educate. I mean, that's really the bottom line. So if you want to try to catch the potential hangers-on to some kind of hateful ideology, you're going to have to educate them. Part of educating them is teaching them all about these things we're talking about. It's a very important part about that education. So I guess that's my answer. I mean, I'm not saying that you can use what I'm talking about and say, boom, we inoculate people. But it's a very important tool in our toolkit, trying to work against the kinds of things that lead to holocausts or genocides or ethnic cleansings or, hate crimes really all around if we wanted them to start spreading it out. There is a toolkit out there. Part of it's education, part of it's having a good understanding of what happened before. So I don't know if I answered you or not, but I tried to. Yeah.
So, God forbid, Ahmadinejad decided that he was going to use his weapons of mass destruction to put Israel, and there was, would it be a Holocaust or genocide if he was successful?
It would be a disaster.
First of all, he's not going to do it.
Well,
let's hope that this remains totally theoretical forever and ever. Yeah.
Let's say it differently.
It would be a disaster. Look at when I wrote one of the earliest articles at Yad Vashem about Ahmadinejad. I wrote for the Israeli press. One of an early articles, very early, and it was when it was just coming as a subject, and we wrote, and I wrote, and then later on people at Yad Vashem said similar things in interviews, that he's the biggest threat to the Jewish people since Hitler. But then some people started saying, not us, that he's the new Hitler, which he isn't. He's something else. He's Ahmadinejad. He's not Hitler. He doesn't have Hitler's ideology. He's not out to do, I don't think, exactly what Hitler wanted to do. He's a big threat to Israel more than anything else. He's a big threat. So I don't know what you'd call it. It would be a horrible disaster, whatever he might do, and let's hope he never manages to do it, and that we figure out how to prevent him from doing anything like that. But I don't know. Our friends at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial called Darfur a genocide. And It might be. I mean, I don't know if it's out. I don't know if it will eventually live up to the law that will call it genocide. But what does it matter? It's a horrible thing that's happening, that's still going on, that most of us aren't paying any attention to, and the world has not yet found a way to stop it. So, part of what also I would suggest is that when we're talking about responses to things, we don't always have to know that it's genocide. It has to be close enough to it, to have enough signs that it looks like it's heading in a direction. That should really make us prick up our ears and start doing things. So, but I don't know, maybe, history, you get documents later on that you figure things out, and that you can talk about the definitions and argue about them. But while it's going on, sometimes it's kind of hard to decide exactly what it is. That's not maybe the point always, though. That goes against everything I just said, of course, but that's not true. In terms of, there are these things out there that need response. Maybe they're not a genocide in the end.
And they need to respond sometimes even before it's happening. I mean, that's the whole thing about education, I think.
Right,
that you don't need to wait for that to happen, that you can, take it seriously when people are just talking about it.
That would be the hope. By the way, we had a meeting this morning with people from the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, and they have a whole long title that they want to change. But that's one of the tools also out there. There's this international body that deals in Holocaust education, fights anti-Semitism as well. It's part of what they do. Yeah. And the fact that such a thing like that exists, that there's a number of countries, I don't remember how many are in the ICC, 24 now, and they have decided that this is an important issue educationally, research, education, that they have to deal with this history of Holocaust because it has a meaning, it has important applications. That's a really good thing. And we didn't have that in the past. That gives me hope that we have such things out there working. As imperfect as that might be too, nothing's perfect, but it gives us a lot of hope that there's things out there that are working in that direction. I think it's important. Beyond it's obvious that we at Yad Vashem think it's important coming out of Israel. I mean, maybe that's obvious, but it's not so obvious that the Swedes think it's important, or that I don't know there's so many other countries there that they all think it's important.
I also think it's important that it's the International Task Force on Holocaust Education and not on genocide. So, and I wanted to ask you, because it's a completely non-scientific observation on my part, that in recent years there's been a real proliferation in the academic world of genocide studies, much more than Holocaust studies. I mean, I don't know if that's true. Like I said, it's non-scientific. It's something I'm observing. But it seems to me that it's actually easier to get onto the curriculum and into faculties when you're talking about genocide studies, through which you can then teach the Holocaust, but it's genocide studies, versus Center for Holocaust Studies or Holocaust Studies program. And it seems to me that trend is here to stay. I don't, or not. I mean, it's sort of like your comments on that.
Well, I agree with you, and I don't know. Again, we've had a whole day here with all kinds of things going on, and I was talking to somebody after, I think, the session this morning as well, and I said something to the effect that today you almost never see Holocaust Studies centers set up. They're always Holocaust and Human Rights or Holocaust and Genocide, and they're married to something. And they're married to something, there's like a double-edged sword. Holocaust education, Holocaust research has been very successful in many ways, and other people wanted to sort of jump on the bandwagon, which is fine too. I mean, they want to, whatever these tragedies are, they want us to know about them, and they want to do it in a similar way. What's happened, though, that some people, though, believe that too much Holocaust is being discussed and not enough of these other tragedies. And instead of saying something to the effect that let's keep studying about the Holocaust the way we're doing it even more, and then let's do these other ones too, they're saying for some reason it's finite and we can only do so much. And so I think that's part of what's happening at universities, of course. And there's a push about, okay, we've talked about the Holocaust now for a lot of years, let's talk about some of the other things. And that's not a good trend for a lot of reasons. I mean, I don't think you need to stop doing one in order to talk about the other. But that is very much what does happen. And or curriculums that push human rights, and so That's where you get the, again, we talked about that earlier too. That's where you get Holocaust in under the roof because they're talking about human rights, and that's how you can get it in. And so your university can get funding for that, but they couldn't get for a Holocaust center only, so they do it together. But those aren't necessarily bad. It just depends how you work with them in reality, and what you do with them. Because the Holocaust is also about human rights. I mean, murdering innocent people and taking away their dignity as you're doing it, that's certainly an issue of human rights. I mean, taking away their citizenship and all those things that happen in various places, those are all human rights issues. The Holocaust is certainly an example of taking away people's human rights. It's not the only one, but it's one. And so it's not that they can't go together, it's just how you talk about them, what you do with them. And then again the politics comes in because, let's face it, I mean, Israel gets smashed all over the place for doing all kinds of things people don't like. And sometimes you see the extremes where in the same breath they'll talk about the Holocaust and they'll talk about what happened in 1948 to the Palestinians. That's also a Holocaust, which it isn't. It's something else. But those things get thrown together too. So there's a lot of problems here that we would call political, essentially, that have to be dealt with. But first we have to be very clear-headed in our understanding of the events. And that's really the first thing that has to happen. So did I answer what you said?
Yeah, more.
Okay.
More than less.
More than less.
I have a question.
Sure.
Given that this is being used politically for a lot of reasons that are not in the best interest of the Jewish people or Israel, I mean, what are the possible consequences of the downgrading of the Holocaust, of, making it seem less than it was? The first, I believe very strongly, the first thing when the societies where the Holocaust occurred, and they don't deal with the Holocaust in a real and open way, that's an opening for all kinds of very bad phenomena. I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian. I direct a library, right? That's what I do much of my time. But if you look at things like Golden Dawn, that's come on the scene in Greece, or you look at the Jobbik Party in Hungary, which is anti-Semitic and rabidly anti-Gypsy, so it's Roma. I think that those people can only get support where the population around them don't know their own history. I mean, I think that it's a riddle how in Greece, which suffered so terribly under German occupation, people can become neo-Nazis. It only means that those becoming neo-Nazis don't know anything about what their grandparents went through, or they don't care. But I mean, probably they don't know. And so, if you downgrade that history, including the Holocaust as part of it, then I think those are some of the consequences that you have by not looking at your history squarely. Then there's other things as well, but again in the political arena, because we in Israel are often accused, again, of using the Holocaust for all kinds of things. And so that's part of the downgrading as well. Again, so if you're looking at it clearly, I don't think you get to that. But when you start trying to distort, manipulate, diminish, whatever, that's where all those things get an opening. It seems like the Holocaust was obviously used against the Jews to try to kill everyone, and now it's being used against the Jews in Israel. Like it's like the enemies just keep finding new ways to use it.
Well, again, a great example of that comes from the Institute of Historical Review. The Institute of Historical Review is was the main United States portal. I don't know what to call it. A portal's not the way. Actually, they're spouting out Holocaust denial. Yeah? Disseminators of Holocaust denial. And I mean, I didn't hear this first. I heard this secondhand. We're sort of reporting about what they're doing, but their leader's a man named Mark Weber. And apparently about 2 years ago, Mark Weber at a meeting said, Holocaust denial is really hurting us in our real agenda, because the real agenda was an anti-Israel agenda. And he said maybe we should tone down the Holocaust denial, because it was more important for the anti-Israel agenda than the Holocaust denial agenda. So that's a very interesting thing going on, the marriage there between the denial and the anti-Israel, and which is really maybe more important to some of these people. Now this is just one place and one guy, but it was the most dominant one. And it was a pretty interesting thing that that's what they were thinking. Again, around 2 years ago when they heard it. I don't know what they're thinking today, but that's what they were thinking.
What's interesting about them, though, they're a very insidious group, because you can be doing research on the internet.
Oh yeah, and you get their stuff.
And you get their stuff, and it seems at first to be very legitimate. And they're called the Institute for Historical Review. In fact, there's a very good professor at York who's called Mark Weber, who works on German Jewish history.
Yeah.
And it's very confusing because he's very good, and then you end up with, and you know, I have on occasion, without paying too much attention, said, oh, that looks interesting, I'm going to print it. And I printed stuff from there by accident. And they're very insidious, but they're not popping up as much on the internet now, and I don't actually know why. So
okay, I'm not sure either, and I'm not sure. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about trying to get the big providers to take off the hate material and stuff. I'll be honest, I missed my last meeting. I missed my meeting now. No, I was in Dublin in my last meeting of this forum of the anti-Semitism. I didn't hear the reports because I was doing another Wallenberg
on the
thing.
internet.
No, well, in general, on the anti-Semitism or the global. That's where I hear my updates. And I happen to miss the last one because of another.
It's just it is notable though.
Yeah, well, it could be, and maybe they're doing things. I don't know, because there was discussion about trying to take these things down. I know that in Twitter there was discussion. There was some neo-Nazi something that they were taking down. I mean, it's in the news all the time. These things. So there are people that are trying to fight these things, not just to the level I'm talking about, but the level of law and the level of media and all kinds of places.